All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the online hangout for February 23. We're on week 6 of the semester out of 15 weeks, so we're about a third of the way through, a little more than a third of the way through. This week we start our last unit on ethical theory, and then we're going to do some practical things going forward. This week's, let me go ahead and share the lesson here. Yeah, so this week's discussion is on honesty, integrity, and virtue. Our last ethical theory is virtue ethics, which is Aristotle's theory. This is the oldest of the 3 ethical theories that we've talked about. Remember, the other 2 are deontology, it's concerned with duties, and consequentialism, concerned with maximizing the good, maximizing happiness. Both consequentialism and deontology really become popular in the 17th and 18th century. Virtue ethics is a lot older. It's from Aristotle. Aristotle's a Greek philosopher about 2,000 years ago, ancient Greece. And he has a very different conception of what ethics looks like. So my plan today is to go over Aristotle's theory just a little bit with the goal. So I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle's theory. I also have the goal of talking about integrity as a virtue, and I want to talk about what integrity means, what it means to be a virtue in the first place, but really why is it important to have integrity, especially in a professional ethics context. Why does integrity matter? So I'll talk a little bit about Aristotle and his ideas, and I'll talk a little bit about integrity. That's the whole plan for today. Just to preview a little bit, lesson 7 next week. Next week will be a little bit different than our normal weeks. For lesson 7, we're going to be going through the NSPE Code of Ethics for Engineers. A lot of you have already looked at this. We've had an assignment before where I asked you to look at it briefly. So several of you have already looked at this a little bit. But we're going to go over the Code of Ethics in some detail. The other thing, and what makes next week's lesson a little bit different, is that instead of writing a post on some general topic like we've been doing, next week what I'm going to ask you to do is look at the NSPE Board of Ethical Review. So they have a Board of Ethics. The Board of Ethics reviews cases, and they've reviewed cases every year going back to 1958. And so you can go to any one of these years. Let's pull up, there's 1971, just a random. And there's a bunch of cases, some 10 or 11 cases that they've covered. If you go to one of these cases, it describes all the facts about the case and then raises a bunch of ethical questions. It talks about the codes of ethics that are relevant to this question. And then it has some discussion where the NSPE Board of Review actually goes over the ethical considerations at stake, whether these represent a violation of the Code of Ethics or not. Not all the cases that they consider do they consider violations. Sometimes they think that nothing wrong has happened. But they consider all these cases. These are real-world cases where one of the ethical codes might be questionable or might be open to interpretation, and they give you a decision where they go through the facts of the case, they give you their reasoning, and they come to some conclusion. This helps a lot. It helps, I think, both to understand the Code of Ethics itself, what the different sections of the code mean, what they actually commit the engineer to. This also gives you a sense of how the profession understands these codes and how they interpret them in particular cases. So this lesson 7, the point of this lesson is that we go through a bunch of these cases. These are real-world cases that are actually look like the kinds of situations that you might encounter as an engineer on the job. So what I'm asking you to do for this assignment is, instead of writing about just any arbitrary topic, I want you to look up one of these cases and give it a complete analysis. Describe the case, maybe interpret it in terms of the ethical theories we've discussed, in terms of the Code of Ethics itself, and whether you think the ruling was fair or not, if you would have decided differently, whether you think these things, this kind of case could come up in your own career. I give some of the reasoning for some of these cases just to give a little preview, and then I'm asking you in lesson 7 to go over this yourself. The quiz also for lesson 7 is a little bit different. Again, this is like the quiz for last week, where I give you a case and your job is to analyze the case. Okay, so that's just looking forward a little bit to lesson 7. Right now we're on lesson 6, but I just wanted to preview what happens in lesson 7. Actually, let me go ahead one more from lesson 7. So lesson 7 is the ethical codes. Lesson 8, after that, is where we're going to do the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So this is one of our extensive case studies where we actually look at a bunch of the details behind the oil spill. Again, in this case, you're asked to pick an issue that you're interested in to talk about basically whatever you want related to this issue. But I give a lot of resources here for looking through the case, for going over the details, including some of the emails being sent by the engineers at the time. There's a lot of good resources here. One of the reasons I give you this extensive case study is because in lesson 9 we're going to do a case study on geoengineering. But then lessons 10 and 11 is your research week, where I'm asking you to pick your own case study and to give it a thorough analysis. In lesson 10, you're going to be giving the research portion of that analysis, and then in lesson 11, I'm asking you to give an ethical analysis of the case. Right? So in lesson 10, I want you to just describe the facts of the case, and then in lesson 11, I want you to actually analyze the ethics, who's responsible, how should they be held accountable, that kind of thing. So this is just doing a little bit of preview of what's coming up over the next few weeks. I hope this looks okay. This looks manageable. One reason I'm preparing you for the research week is because you're going to have to do your own independent research. In particular, I'm asking you to find 4 scholarly articles to frame your research. That means articles that are not just Wikipedia or just opinion pieces in the news. I want you to use like a real search engine or a database, maybe the library. And that's going to take some time. This is going to take more time than normal, than you normally spend on a week's lesson. And the points for this lesson are also different. So normally your post for each week is 30 points for the post and 30 points for replies. Your research presentation is worth 80 points for just your research, and then another 30 points for your replies for that week. And then I'm asking you to do an annotated bibliography that'll serve as the quiz for these weeks. So this is slightly more work than you'll be used to. It'll take you some time. It's not the kind of thing you can do last minute. And it's worth a lot of points, so if you do it last minute and you do a bad job on it, it's going to hurt you in your final grade. So just be aware of that. This is lessons 10 and 11. We're in lesson 6 right now. So you have a few weeks for this, but that means you should probably start thinking about what cases you want to do research on. Maybe start doing some preliminary research. So I'm just trying to give you ample forewarning. Okay, so there's people in the chat. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments, concerns, anything you want to talk about before I get going on this week's lesson. I'll go ahead and check the other pages also. And again, feel free to leave me a message there or in the chat, either on the video or in G+. Thank you, Kevin. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into the lesson. I guess I'll show a wall of text again. I'm going to be talking a lot. I might just jump back to myself eventually, but let's look at the lesson in some detail first. We're on lesson 6. All right, so the goal of this lesson is to talk about integrity as a virtue. And in order to do that, I first want to talk about what virtues are and why they're important. Virtues are often emphasized in an alternative ethical theory from the ones we've already talked about. We've talked about consequentialism. Consequentialism wants to maximize happiness, cause the least amount of suffering, the greatest happiness among the greatest number. Deontology thinks that we have certain ethical obligations, ethical duties that we are morally required to perform, even if the consequences don't maximize happiness. Right? Even if people are hurt in the process, you still might have the obligation, deontologist thinks, to do the right. And so the way I characterized this before is that the consequentialists want to maximize the good in terms of happiness. The deontologists want to maximize the right in terms of the ethical duties and principles. And the virtue ethics disagrees with both of them. The first thing to say about virtue ethics is that it's not an act-based moral theory. Both consequentialism and deontology are interested in whether or not the actions that you perform are the right actions, right? Did you do the right thing, right? If you pulled the lever in the trolley case, was that the right thing, right? The issue is whether your actions were the right actions, and the issue is not whether you're a good person. Both the consequentialist and the deontologist would agree that you might still be a good person even if you do a bad thing, right? Sometimes people do bad things, and that might not mean that they're bad people, just that they did the wrong thing, right? They should have decided otherwise. Most people, when we were talking about Dennis Joya in the Ford cases, most people said that Joya is not a bad person. In fact, they probably would have, people writing said they probably would have decided the same way if they were in Joya's position. Right? Joya's not a bad person. We can understand why he chose the way he did, right? The kinds of pressures in a high-stress corporate environment like that. Makes a lot of sense. We can understand, we can empathize with Joya's position. So maybe he's not a bad person. But even if he's not a bad person, the consequentialist, maybe even the deontologist, wants to say that he did a bad thing, right? He should have done otherwise, right? He should have issued a recall, even though the corporate script said no because he thought otherwise. Some people in the discussion sections disagreed with this. Some people in the discussion sections did think that Joya did the right thing, but a lot of people think, the majority, I think, in the discussion sections, think that Joya did the wrong thing and he should have done otherwise. It doesn't make him a bad person. It just means that he made the wrong action. Okay, so virtue ethics isn't really concerned about individual actions, and the virtue ethicist recognizes that sometimes good people do bad things, sometimes bad people do good things, and the issue isn't so much about what you do as about who you are, what kind of character do you have. The virtue ethicist is primarily concerned with cultivating good characters, good people, in the full sense of the person, right? Not just the individual actions that they take, but the whole person over the course of their life. And one of the things that the virtue ethicist recognizes is that being a good person, having a good character, is not something that's easy to do, but it's something that in fact takes a lot of practice and training over a lifetime. You have to develop a good character. You don't just get one for free. And you don't just get a good character because you want to do the right things. And you don't just get a good character because you do the right things sometimes, right? But a good character is someone who consistently and reliably does the right things. Right? So this is why I'm linking this to the discussion of integrity. That something about having a good character is a matter of having integrity, in the sense that you're dependable, not just that you do the right things, but you do it reliably, dependably, so they can count on you to do the right thing next time. Right? This is what integrity gives you. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the theory here. So it's not just doing the right thing, but having a good character. Aristotle thinks that ethics is a matter of having a good character, is developing good habits. He says, excellent. He says, so this is called virtue ethics. It's about virtues. The Greek word for virtue is arete, A-R, that's from last time, arete. Let me pull this up. Oops. Yeah, arete. Arete is the Greek word for excellence. Excellence in the sense of the best. So think of the best apple that you can think of. Maybe you don't like apples, but you can even someone who doesn't like apples recognizes a good apple from a bad apple. Right? There's certain qualities, there's certain characteristics that make a good apple good, make them different from a bad apple. Right? A bad apple is rotten, it's squishy, right? It's bruised all over. But a good apple is crisp and juicy. It tastes fresh. It doesn't have any bad spots on it. Right? These are the things that make an apple the best. The best here doesn't mean the greatest. The best apple isn't always the biggest apple. It's not always the most expensive apple. The best apple is the one that best exemplifies the qualities that we seek in apples. Right? Right? What does it mean to be a good apple? Those qualities of good apples are the virtues of an apple, the features that make it best. So with this in mind, the way that I like to talk about this is that consequentialism wants to maximize the good in terms of happiness, and deontology wants to maximize the right in terms of our ethical obligations. Whereas the virtue ethicist wants to emphasize the best, wants to maximize the best in terms of the virtues, right? The virtue ethicist wants us to be the best person that we can be, wants us to have those admirable character traits that represent the best qualities of a person, being honest, brave, fair, kind, and so on. Right, so the virtuous person is the one who exemplifies those best characters in a person. Right, not all of us are perfect. No one's perfect. And some people act better than others. Everyone acts poorly sometimes. Some people act better than others. And the virtues are those qualities that we want to see in people, that we like in people, that represent admirable character traits, that we would want to emulate ourselves. People who are fair and honest and brave. We should also be fair and honest and brave, because the people who are fair and honest and brave are, in some sense, the best kind of people. Right? They're representing an excellence in persons that we should all try to emulate. Okay, so let me talk about the theoretical background for this just a little bit. I don't have a lot of strong ethical views, but I guess Aristotle is the theory that I'm most sympathetic with, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So here's Aristotle's idea. Aristotle thinks that all living creatures are aimed at the good life. They want the good life. And the good life here doesn't mean just a life of pleasure, of pure hedonistic pleasure. The good life here means we might call living well, doing well. Philosophers usually like the word flourishing. Flourishing in the sense that a garden flourishes. We can all imagine the difference between a flourishing garden, a garden that's healthy and productive, versus a rotting garden where the plants are dying and there's a bunch of weed and so on, and it's not healthy, it's not productive. There's a clear distinction between the productive and the healthy, the flourishing garden, and the unhealthy garden. And it's this idea of health, of flourishing, that Aristotle thinks all living creatures aim at. It's our goal, in some sense, to live a healthy, good life, a life free from suffering, a life free from torment, a life that is easy and happy, where we do our best, where we can be our best selves, do our best work. Aristotle thinks that all creatures want this, not just human beings. A cat wants to be the best cat it can be, live the best cat life, and a horse wants to live the best horse life, and so on. But what's good for the horse is different from what's good for the cat, and is different again from what's good for the human being, because we're different kinds of creatures and we need different kinds of things. So Aristotle recognizes that what counts as the best is going to depend on who you are and what you need. Right? What's best for cats is just different from what's best for humans. A cat, for instance, needs 16 hours of sleep a day. A cat won't be healthy if it's not getting something like 16 hours of sleep a day. That's healthy for a cat. That's what a cat should be doing. If a cat is getting 16 hours of sleep a day, it's living a good life. If a human being is getting 16 hours of sleep a day, that's probably not good for the human being. There's probably some medical complication. A human being needs 6 to 8 hours of sleep a day, maybe a little bit more depending on what you're doing, but not 16 hours of sleep. Right? So if you're sleeping 16 hours, that's unhealthy. There's nothing unhealthy about sleeping 16 hours in general. It's unhealthy because of the kind of thing you are, and cats are different kinds of things than humans. But it's this general idea of aiming at the good that is the focus of Aristotle's ethical theory here, that we want to aim at the good. So the image that's typically used here is the image of an archer with a bow and arrow pulling and aimed at a bullseye. It's the goal of the archer to hit the target, hit the bullseye, dead center. And there's a lot of things that the archer can do to make sure that it hits that bullseye. They can steady their arm. They can aim it well. There's also things that are sort of out of the archer's control. The wind, there might be a gust of wind that blows your arrow to the side that you weren't expecting. These are the kind of things that you can't anticipate that are unlucky. But for the most part, you're trying to aim at this target, and the question is whether you actually hit the target. Sometimes you hit the target, sometimes you don't. But you want to hit the target. Everyone wants to hit the target. Everyone wants to hit the bullseye. Or everyone wants to live the good life. And so the question is, how do we do that? And Aristotle thinks that the way you do that is by living the virtuous life, by trying to be virtuous. Virtues help you aim so that you hit targets hit the good life. Living a life of virtue is what gets you to hit that target. Right, because living a life of virtue, of excellence, is living the best life you can be, in a sense by definition. So Aristotle thinks that if we live virtuously, then we will live a good life. And Aristotle thinks there's something particular about virtue so that we can know, specifically that virtues are the middle position. He calls this the doctrine of the mean. And the idea is that the virtues are the middle position between two extremes. So what a virtuous life is it's really a balanced life. It's a life lived in moderation between different extremes. And Aristotle gives a bunch of examples of this. There's a little chart Aristotle has of the different virtues and their relative extremes. So for instance, courage. Courage is a virtue. The best kind of life, the good life, is a life lived courageously. And what is courage? Well, for Aristotle, courage is the middle point between two extremes, an extreme of deficiency and an extreme of excess. So the extreme of deficiency is cowardice. If you're not courageous, one way of not being courageous is being a coward. This is a deficiency. This is a deficiency of courage. You don't have enough courage. It's an extreme lack of courage. Right? The coward runs away from danger instead of facing danger. The courageous person can face danger, but the courageous person doesn't face danger irrationally. The courageous person faces danger when courage is called for, but when courage is not called for, the courageous person also knows when to go away. And that's the other extreme, the extreme of rashness. A rash person runs headlong into danger without thinking carefully about what they're doing. Right? So imagine a burning building, and there's a child screaming from the second-story window, and the coward sees the situation and just panics and runs away. The rash person runs immediately inside without thinking about how best to save the child, whether the child can even be saved, whether there's a better route to take. So the rash person just runs immediately inside, putting themselves and everyone else in danger. Aristotle thinks that the courageous person avoids both extremes by acting in this moderate way. The courageous person, when faced with this burning building, assesses the situation rationally. You know, what are my options? What are the things that will best protect that person, best protect myself? Right? What is the smartest choice? And the courageous person will do what is smartest. If the smartest thing to do is to run in that building and try to save the child, then the courageous person will do that. But if the smartest thing to do is instead, wait for the fire truck ladder to get the child from the window, so no one has to run inside, maybe that's the smartest thing to do. And maybe it would have been just stupid, foolhardy to run inside. And so the courageous person doesn't do that. Right? The courageous person does what's best. Right? That's what it means to be virtuous, to do what's best. And for Aristotle, doing what's best is this middle position between these two extremes. Maybe the archetype, the paradigm, middle virtue is temperance. Temperance is precisely the virtue of moderation. The temperate person doesn't go to extremes in either way. So the temperate person, the words that Aristotle uses here, insensible and dissipation, aren't very helpful. We can think of temperance as moderate. So maybe in eating food, the temperate person eats, eats reasonable portions, a sensible meal. A deficiency of temperance, someone who refuses to eat anything at all, maybe someone who's abstinent, refuses to eat anything, is on some health craze where they don't think they should eat anything, that they're afraid of all calories. Well, that's not healthy. You can make yourself very sick if you don't eat a healthy meal. Right? So that's too far in one direction. The other is excessive eating. Right? Someone who's gluttonous and eats way more until they're beyond stuffed, until they hurt themselves and pass out from too much food. Right? Aristotle's going to say that's also excessive. You shouldn't do that either. You shouldn't eat to excess. You shouldn't also starve yourself. You should eat a moderate amount, a healthy amount. Right? That's where you're going to be where you're going to be happiest. The good life is in eating this moderate amount. And same thing with the other virtues. Generosity. You shouldn't be stingy, but you also shouldn't be wasteful. You should give where it's appropriate, but you shouldn't never give. You should give sometimes. Right? You shouldn't be stingy. But you also shouldn't just give away so much that it's wasteful. You should be careful in how you give. Right? You should be generous, but only to a point. Nothing in excess. All right. Let me stop here and see how things are going. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I guess I can keep talking. If anyone has any questions, please interrupt me. So one more thing to say, just to remind you from the beginning, is that these are meant to be character traits. A courageous person, a temperate person, a generous person. These are not meant to be descriptions of actions, right? So the courageous person doesn't just do one courageous act. Anyone can do one courageous act. Right? The courageous person consistently does courageous acts over time. And in fact, a courageous person, you can rely on them to do something courageous in the future. The generous person is generous consistently. Anyone can give things away once or twice, but a generous person consistently gives things away in a way that's not wasteful. Right? So again, these are meant to be descriptions of characters. These are the kinds of person being described by this character trait. Right? This isn't just a description of a single action. This is a description of an overall character. Yeah. So okay. So because we're talking about the character of a person and not just individual actions, Aristotle asks us to tell a developmental story of how we come to have a good character. Right? Having a good character isn't just about doing the right thing once or twice. It's about doing the right thing consistently. Right? So how do we develop this character? And Aristotle thinks that the way we develop this character is by developing a habit. He says, excellence is the art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence. Rather, we have those because we've acted rightly. We are what we do repeatedly. Excellence then is not a virtue. I'm sorry. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. Virtue is not an act, but a habit. So Aristotle thinks that in order to be virtuous, in order to have a virtuous character, you need to develop virtuous habits. Or you need to be able to act in this way almost without thinking. So one of the ways that Aristotle talks about this, let me go to my notes here. He talks about the extent to which we have a choice over the matter. Remember the image of the archer trying to hit the bullseye. There's things the archer can do that'll affect whether the arrow hits the bullseye, and there's things that are outside of the archer's hands. A gust of wind, for instance, might affect where the arrow flies. So what choice or control do we have for our actions? Oh, there's a comment. So being virtuous, according to what you said, is about generally doing the best option. Yeah, so Mina asks, is being virtuous doing the best option? It's a good question. And answering that question means we have to understand what it means to say that it's the best. If we're a consequentialist, then we think that the best is the option that has the best outcomes, right? The best consequences. If we're a deontologist, we think the best is what follows the rules, the obligations that constrain our behaviors. Aristotle thinks that what counts as the best are the things that are these middle positions, right? This middle ground between two extremes. So he's not looking at this in terms of the consequences. He's not looking at what saves more lives. He's looking at what does it say about your character? Is your character appropriately moderate? Maybe let me give one more example to to talk about this a little bit more. Aristotle thinks that one of the virtues is friendliness. Being friendly is a sign of a good character, of a good person. The two ways of not being friendly is one is to be quarrelsome or sultry, argumentative. No one likes someone who's too argumentative, too stubborn, incorrigible. So maybe you shouldn't be too quarrelsome. But you should also just not flatter people for no reason, or if only to advantage yourself. Right? You shouldn't be excessively friendly. Right? You shouldn't just be friends with people because you want to be popular. You should be friendly in a reasonable way. Now, one of the things that means that some people might expect you to flatter them, especially like rich and famous people. If you're hanging around Kanye West, for instance, he might expect a certain amount of flattery and respect, because that's just the kind of people he hangs out with. That's what he expects of all the people in his entourage. And maybe that's more friendly than you want to be, and so maybe he's put off by the fact that you're not flattering him. Or maybe you're in a situation where people really are being disagreeable and you're not arguing with them. You're being too friendly to people who are quarrelsome. Maybe that's also advice. The point here is that some people might be turned off by your being virtuous. Right? Some people might expect you to do more or less than the moderate. Right? Some people might expect you to do more or less than just being moderate. So a moderate person drinks occasionally. A moderate person doesn't abstain from all drinking. A moderate person doesn't drink to excess. A moderate person drinks once in a while. They have a glass of wine with dinner, whatever. Some people might be offended that you have a glass of wine with dinner. Some people might argue against you having that glass of wine with dinner. So acting in this virtuous way might not keep the peace. Everyone might not like it. In fact, people might resent you for it in some ways. But you should still do it. You should still do it because it's for the best. And it's for the best in the sense that it's the moderate position. And this is what's best for human people. So again, Aristotle thinks that what is best for you depends on who you are. But he thinks that once you know who you are, and once you know the kind of thing that you are, then there's something that's very clearly best for you. So I was talking about the difference between cats and horses, cats and humans earlier, where cats need 16 hours of sleep, and humans don't need 16 hours of sleep. So what's best for the cat is to get 16 hours of sleep. What's best for the human is to get 8 hours of sleep. So what's the best option for sleep? Well, it depends on the kind of thing you are. You have to actually look at the differences. And the same thing for human beings, even within human beings. Aristotle is going to recognize, for instance, that some people have different calorie requirements than others. Right? Some people need to eat more than others to maintain their health. Right? So there's no general rule about how much you should eat. How much you should eat is really going to depend on who you are and differences in your body type and so on. So there's no general rule. You have to pay attention to the particulars about who you are. That makes ethics very hard. You can give these rules of thumb about finding the middle ground, the temperate position, but there's no general rule that you can always follow to make sure you're doing the right thing. Right? How much is the appropriate amount for you to eat? Well, that depends, and the only way to find it out is by testing it out. Right? You eat some if you think you're overeating, if you're gaining more weight than you're comfortable with or whatever, then maybe you should cut back. And there's no way to know that in advance. The way you figure that out is through practice. Through practice developing these habits. Right? So if I develop a habit of always eating junk food, then I'm going to live an unhealthy life. Right? Then I'm going to have an unhealthy body. And it's because I've developed this habit. If I want to avoid that, I need to develop habits of eating healthy foods, of eating vegetables, and a balanced meal on a regular basis. If I engage in that habit often enough, then it'll become second nature. If I do it often enough, then I will stop liking junk food. Right? Junk food won't appeal to me anymore. Because I've developed a different habit. I've developed a habit where that vice doesn't fit in. I hope this is answering some of the questions. These are good questions. If anyone else has questions, please let me know. Feel free to jump in on the mic. So Mina says he's trying to differentiate between being virtuous and consequentialism. It's a good question. Sometimes this is difficult. I think the virtuous person doesn't want to just maximize the general consequences, But I think the really important point, the really deep point, is that the virtue ethicist doesn't think that there is a general rule for knowing what's best. The consequentialist does think there's a general rule. The rule is to maximize happiness. What's best is what makes the most people happy. The virtue ethicist doesn't think that it's that simple. It doesn't think that there's any general rule you can follow in this way. And in fact, sometimes you should do things that don't make people happy, because the goal isn't to be happy, the goal is to be healthy. Right? So making everyone happy might mean eating junk food more often than is appropriate. Maybe that makes people happy, but it doesn't make them very healthy. And so maybe they shouldn't eat junk food, even if they would prefer to eat junk food, even if it would make them happier to eat junk food. Right? The consequentialist wants to say that if people are happy eating junk food and it doesn't hurt them, then let them eat junk food. The virtue ethicist wants to say that, well, maybe it doesn't hurt them in any serious way, but it doesn't make them healthy. It hurts their long-term health, and it's very subtle. It's not a big problem to have a candy bar, except that it cultivates these bad habits, and it makes it harder to avoid having candy bars in the future. So the real difference here is about the way that they reason about what's good or bad. And again, the consequentialist thinks that there's a rule you can follow. The virtue ethicist thinks that there is no rules. And this is really important to how the virtue ethicist thinks we ought to be thinking about our own moral activity. If there's no rules, if I can't just follow a rule book to figure out what to do, if there's no formulas for deciding what the best action is, then I'm left with a couple of options. One is practice and recognize that sometimes I make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes and try to become a better person. The other is to look for virtuous people and try to emulate them. Right? Look for people that I consider to be a virtuous character and try to do what they do. Right? Because maybe I don't always know what to do, but if I see what the virtuous person does, then it'll help me figure out what I can do myself. This isn't a foreign idea. We see this all the time. Christians, sometimes you see them wearing the bracelets that say WWJD, what would Jesus do? Right? And the idea is to have them remind themselves about what Jesus would do, right? With the idea that Jesus is a virtuous character. If we see what he would do in some situation, then I can use that to figure out what I should do also. Right? If I want to do what's best in this virtuous sense, then I should try to emulate these virtuous characters. You might think Jesus is a virtuous character, but you can do this without religious figures. Sometimes I ask myself what my dad would do in a situation. My car breaks down on the side of the road, it gets a flat tire. Okay, well, what would my dad do here? How would my dad handle this situation? And I think this way. I think about what my dad would do because my dad knows how to handle this kind of situation. And maybe I don't know how to handle it as well, but I know my dad does. And so if I can imagine what he would do, then I should do that because that's probably the right thing to do. The virtuous, right? So the important point here is that this isn't a rule to follow. This doesn't give me a hard and fast rule that ensures that I always do the right thing. Instead, it gives me a model on which I can develop my character to try to be more like that person. Right? And so we want virtuous characters. We want to focus on these virtuous characters to help ourselves become virtuous. Jesus or your father, Gandhi, right? These moral figures that we look up to, and we look up to them as exemplars of how we should act also. Since we're talking about Aristotle, Aristotle makes a big deal about courage, and his example of a courageous person would be Achilles from the Iliad, from Homer's Iliad. Achilles was a hero. He would run headlong into battle and fight off lots of soldiers. He was a courageous person. Achilles wasn't virtuous in other ways. He had other issues. He was vain. He was too proud. And these other problems made him make certain kinds of mistakes, political mistakes. He made enemies and so on. So being virtuous in one respect doesn't mean you're virtuous in all respects. You can be a courageous person but still be a jerk. Right? You can be a generous person but still be not friendly. Right? You'd still be a coward. So These individual virtues signify different aspects of your character. To be a good person overall, you want to be virtuous in all these respects. That's a hard task, maybe even an impossible task. Maybe no one's virtuous in all these ways. But we're all aiming at the good life. And Aristotle thinks that acting in these virtuous ways helps us along the road. It doesn't ensure that we're going to hit the bullseye, but it makes it more likely, it makes it easier to hit the bullseye than if we weren't doing these things. So Aristotle thinks we ought to be virtuous for these reasons. Let me just say that in the main lesson, one of the articles that I link is this Good Engineer article, where Harris argues for virtue ethics in an engineering context, and in particular, the idea that that thinking of ethics in terms of hard and fast rules that we should or shouldn't follow, like the rules for when you should or shouldn't blow the whistle. Part of Harris's point here is that life is more complicated, ethics is more complicated than can be captured in a bunch of simple rules. What it really requires is developing a good character, developing the kind of character that knows how to respond in the appropriate way, right? Developing these virtues, right? Not just have a bunch of rules, but have these virtuous principles, right? So act courageously. That doesn't tell you what to do in any particular situation, but if you think about whether or not your acts are courageous, maybe that helps you perform better, right? Do better things. I won't say too much about this article, but I hope you guys read it and say something about ethics and virtue ethics in engineering. Yeah, so we've talked about virtuous characters. Why we might need to look to a virtuous character, because we don't have rules. Because we don't have rules for deciding what to do, right? So we use these heuristics, model a virtuous character. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you the word of the day and let you sign on the word of the day. There's still a couple of things I want to say about Aristotle and ethics, but I'll go ahead and give you the word of the day. The word of the day is arete. If you type arete into the sign-in sheet, you will get extra credit for today's online lecture. The word of the day is arete. Oh, does my thing still say 5 minutes? Let me change that. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Hyrule, do you want to speak? Do you want to speak on the mic? Oh, in attendance, how do we get 5 points? So, good question. So remember that attendance credit is worth 5 points maximum, and that's all extra credit. So you're not losing points if you don't get full 5 points. Every one of those points that you get is extra credit. You can't lose points on attendance. So the way that the attendance credit works is that it's 5 points per week. And there's 3 things you can do to earn attendance credit. You can come to this online lecture, and this online lecture is worth 4 points. So if you come to this lecture and you sign in on the sign-in sheet, if you sign in by midnight with the word of the day, you get 4 points for attending this lecture. The other 2 things are attending the live lectures on Tuesday after this class, starting at 4, and on Friday, also starting at 4. If you attend either of each of those classes is worth 2 points each. So if you go to both live lectures, you get 2 points. If you go to both live lectures, you'll get 4 points. If you go to the online lecture, you get 4 points. If you go to the online lecture and one of the live lectures, you can earn 5 points. That's the only way to earn 5 points, is if you've both gone to the online lecture and to the live lectures. Very few people are actually doing that. Yeah, 5 points is the maximum. You can't earn more than 5 points. So if you go to the online lecture and one live lecture, you've already earned the maximum 5 points. If you go to the last lecture, you'll still get credit. I'll still mark it down, but you won't get any additional points from that. All right. I hope that all makes sense. Good question. Thank you very much for letting me clarify that. So Alexander Reyes left a question on the Google Hangouts. He says, so an example of deontology and happiness, a police officer stopping a crime before it can be committed. He also says good people are rooted, good people, I'm not sure what this means. I think this is like a typo error. If Alexander can ask his question again, maybe jump into the chat. The idea of stopping a crime before it's committed. I don't know that any of the three ethical theories would have a problem with that. Consequentialists would like the crime to be stopped before it happens. The deontologist, I don't think there's anything wrong with stopping a crime before it happens, if it's reflective of a goodwill. The virtue ethicists, I don't think they would have a problem either. Explain again of virtue ethics. Kevin's asking me to explain virtue ethics again. Yeah, so virtue ethics, one more time, virtue ethics, the word virtue here, yeah, the difference between virtue ethics and the others. Again, think of the word virtue as excellence. So the virtues are the best properties of people, the best ways that people can be. Honest, brave, fair, kind. The best people, the people that we most strongly admire, are the people who are brave, fair, and kind in these ways, the people who exemplify these virtues. These virtues are character traits, right? The people who are brave and kind and fair aren't just brave once or kind once. They're brave and kind repeatedly, regularly. They've developed it into a habit, right? So the really big difference between virtue ethics and the other ethical theories is that virtue ethics is looking at the character of a person, who they are as a whole person, over their whole life, right? The kind of person they are. Consequentialism and deontology both are only looking at the actions that people take. Was that action a good action or a bad action? Should they have done that or shouldn't they have done that? Both consequentialism and deontology don't say anything at all about the person doing the action. They don't say anything about the character of the person doing the action, whether they're a good person or a bad person. On virtue ethics and deontology, there's no good people and bad people. There's just good acts and bad acts. And we should do the good things and we should do the not do the bad things. On Aristotle's view, it's more than just doing the right thing once. It's doing the right thing as a matter of your character, that you've developed the habit of doing the right thing. So let me just go a little bit more into the theory here, just briefly. I'm almost done. So Aristotle talks about having the habit of excellence. There's a couple of things to say about this. Excellence is a habit in the sense that it's something that we do repeatedly. This is one of the things that distinguishes ancient moral theory from contemporary moral theory. The focus on action today really shows that in the modern world we emphasize choice quite a lot, that we're making a conscious choice to make this action. And in Aristotle's time, the choice to make the right action wasn't that important. It wasn't so important that you're deliberately acting. In fact, deliberately acting in a particular way might actually be the worst option. A habit, on the other hand, is something, it's like the autopilot, it's like the default behaviors from Wallace's discussion of this is water. Right? A habit is something that you do unconsciously without thinking about it. And what Aristotle is advocating here is not just that we act unconsciously, is not just that we resort to our default behavior. Rather, what he's saying is that we should cultivate our default behavior so that we default to excellence, so that we default to our best selves. Right? And the way you do that is by cultivating the habit, doing it regularly. It would be too hard to consciously choose to do the right thing all the time. So Aristotle says instead of trying to deliberately do the right thing, instead you should cultivate the habits of always doing the right thing. And that way, doing the right thing becomes easy. So he says, if you've cultivated the habit, you have a virtue. And the opposite of virtue is vice. Right? If you don't have the virtue, you have the vice. So virtue is, you're virtuous if you're doing the right thing for the right reason, as a matter of habit. Let me actually make this a little bit smaller. So the virtuous person is doing the right thing for the right reason as a matter of habit. And the vicious person is doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason as a habit. So on Aristotle's view, the opposite of being virtuous is being vicious, having a vice. And the vicious people don't want to do the wrong thing in the sense that they want to do bad. The problem with vicious people is they don't know they're doing the bad thing. They do the bad thing thinking that it's a good thing. On Aristotle's view, everyone aims at the good, even bad people. Even bad people want a good life, right? If someone who's a bank robber who makes a living stealing from other people, maybe they're doing wrong, but they think they're doing right in the sense that they think that that's going to lead them to the good life. Maybe if I rob enough banks, make enough money from robbing banks, then I'll finally live a life of happiness. And what Aristotle's going to say is that the problem here is just that they're wrong about what will bring them happiness. Right? They're doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason. They've developed a habit of doing the wrong thing, and they're wrong. It's the wrong thing in the sense that it won't make them happy. Right? Robbing those banks won't lead them to a life of happiness. In fact, it might make their life a lot worse than it needs to be. If they were smart about it, they wouldn't rob those banks. They would try to find a virtuous path. But they don't know any better. Right? Part of the problem is that they don't realize that what they're doing won't give them happiness. They think, in fact, that what they're doing will bring them happiness, and they're just wrong about that. But Aristotle thinks that most of us aren't vicious in this way. Most people do know what the right thing to do is. Most people aren't vicious, but most people also aren't virtuous because being virtuous is really hard. Yeah, people in the chat, Fola says, I don't think they're bad people. Sometimes they just do bad things. And that's Aristotle's position also. Most people aren't vicious, and most people aren't virtuous either. Virtuous is really hard. Most people lie in between this, and Aristotle says there's two ways of lying in between this. He calls them the continent and the incontinent. Continent and the incontinent. Continent means, you might think of continent as being capable. Someone who's, usually the phrase incontinent, when it's used today, it means someone who can't hold their bladders, right? And it means they lack a certain kind of control. So that's what's going on here also. Someone who's continent, is capable, has control. And on Aristotle's view, the continent person does the right thing, but it's a struggle. The continent person knows what the right thing to do is, knows why it's the right thing to do, but hasn't developed it as a habit. It's not a habit. And so doing the right thing is a struggle. The continent person eventually does the right thing, but they have to think about it very deliberately. They have to think about it really hard, and doing the right thing isn't easy. The incontinent person lacks control, doesn't do the right thing, after a struggle also. So the continent person does the right thing. In fact, the continent person eventually behaves just like the virtuous person, does the same thing the virtuous person does. But the difference between the virtuous and the continent person isn't what they do, but it's how they do it. The virtuous person, it's not an issue at all. They do it without thinking. But the continent person has to really struggle to do the right thing. The incontinent person does the same thing as the vicious person, right? Does the wrong thing. But the continent person isn't like the vicious person doesn't do it in the same way, because the incontinent person knows that the vicious thing is wrong, right? Knows what the right thing to do is, and the incontinent person just fails to do it, right? Fails to do the virtuous thing. So the example that I do this, this is not a very flattering example for myself, but a few years ago, I was teaching at a summer camp. For the last decade, I've taught at this academic summer camp for high school students. And a few years ago, I was at this summer camp, and I had a girlfriend at the time, but there was a girl at the summer camp who was flirting with me, clearly interested in me, and I was tempted to have a fling, to cheat on my girlfriend and have a fling with this person. It's at summer camp, you know, the rules are kind of off at summer camp. I was considering maybe having this affair with this person. Now, I knew what the right thing to do was. I knew it wasn't right to cheat on my girlfriend, but I hadn't really had to face this kind of temptation before. I hadn't mastered the habit of just ignoring all the other potential people, so it was a struggle for me. I was tempted. I thought about cheating on my girlfriend. In the end, I didn't do it. In the end, I was continent, and I stayed loyal to my girlfriend. I didn't actually cheat on her, right? So I did the right thing. But when summer was over and I went back to my girlfriend, I was proud of myself for doing the right thing, a little too proud, and I told my girlfriend that, in fact, I had this opportunity to cheat on her, but I didn't because I loved her that much. And naturally, my girlfriend got very upset at me for having made this claim, right? Because what she was upset at was not that I did the wrong thing. I did the right thing. But what she was upset at was the fact that I had struggled, that it was hard for me to do the right thing, that I was actually tempted, right? Right. The idea here is that there's something bad about having to struggle, that it would have been better, I would have been a better person, I would have been a better boyfriend, if in fact I had been virtuous the whole time and never had to consider the idea of cheating. The fact that I was tempted at all says something about my character. It says something about my commitment to her. It says something about how deeply my character is committed to her. Right. So the point here is that it's better to be virtuous than merely continent. It's better to have cultivated a habit than to merely do the right thing. And I think maybe this will be helpful for people when they're in their own ethical dilemmas, right? To realize that the fact that you struggle with a dilemma is not itself a bad thing. In fact, it shows that it's something that matters to you, and you can still do the virtuous thing while struggling. But maybe it's better to have cultivated habits so that you never find yourself in this struggle in the first place. Right? If you make it a habit to always and every single time follow regulations, right? Follow the legal regulations, follow the codes to the letter. If you do that every single time, you've made it a habit. Then it's not hard in the next case to do it again. And if there's some violation of the codes, it's not hard for you. There's no struggle. There's no second guessing yourself when you want to write it up. An issue a fine or issue a violation of the codes. Right? But if you haven't developed that habit, if sometimes you let people get away with violating codes, right, then every single time that it comes up for a question about whether you're going to enforce a regulation, then it becomes a struggle, right? Do I enforce it this time, or do I let it slide like those other times I've let it slide? And then it becomes difficult, right? If you're merely continent, then it becomes difficult every time you have to make a decision. So Aristotle thinks that we ought to be virtuous instead of merely continent. It's better to be virtuous than continent. It's better to be continent than incontinent, and it's better to be incontinent than vicious. Good. Let me stop here and see if there's any questions. I have two more things I want to say. One, I want to say about I want to talk about moral luck just a little bit, and then I want to talk about integrity one more time. But let me just stop right here to see if there's any questions or comments, concerns. This is the last really big day of theory. We're not going to talk about any more ethical theory going forward. Everything we talk about from here on out is going to be case studies, looking at real life cases. So hopefully these ethical theories can help you do your analysis. There's no midterms or finals in this class. You're not required to know these theories well, but I'm a nerd, so I like going through the theories in some detail. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I want to say just a couple of other things about Aristotle. Well, I want to say one more thing about Aristotle, and then I want to talk about integrity. I want to say something first about moral luck. Remember the picture that we started with of the archer aiming at the bullseye? There's things that the archer can control, and that has to do with the virtues. You should be virtuous because the more virtuous you are, Aristotle thinks, the better you'll be able to hit that bullseye, the better you'll be able to live the good life. But Aristotle also recognizes that some of our moral character is not fully under our control. Right? The gust of wind that blows the arrow to the side, there's not a whole lot you could have done about that. You might have anticipated for the wind, but you can't always know where the wind's going to blow. So there's only so much you can do. And sometimes, for this reason, you get the short end of the stick through no fault of your own. Right? This is moral luck. Moral luck is moral consequences that happen to people through no fault of their own. Aristotle thinks that moral luck is a reality, and moral luck affects our chances at happiness. Right? Because of some things that might just be a matter of luck, we have a better or worse chance at happiness. For instance, one of the examples that Aristotle uses is being ugly. So Aristotle recognizes, and we saw this already, that one of the virtues is friendliness, that in order to be a good person, in order to have a great soul, you need to be friendly, you need to have friends. You can't live a good life without having friends, Aristotle thinks. But some people have an easier time making friends than others. In particular, ugly people have a really hard time making friends because they're ugly, and people don't like ugly people. And it's not the ugly person's fault that they have a hard time making friends. They were just born that way. Maybe they have ugly parents, but it's not their fault that they're ugly. But nevertheless, being ugly makes it harder to make friends. Right? Beautiful people have a very easy time making friends. Beautiful people get a lot of social deference because they're beautiful. And ugly people have a hard time making friends. They have a harder lot in life because they're ugly. Ugly people can still live a good life. Ugly people can still make friends. It's just a lot harder for them to do so. They have a much greater challenge to face in doing so. And this is just a matter of moral luck. Right? It wasn't their fault. It wasn't anything that they did. It's just an accident of who they are. It's just something completely out of anyone's control. So these features out of our control can still affect whether or not we live the good life, can still affect our moral circumstances. Luck. Maybe a more realistic example than being ugly. Aristotle actually uses the ugly example, but it's not a great example. Maybe the better example is poverty. Aristotle uses this example too. People who are born into wealth and luxury have an easier time making virtuous decisions. Have an easier time being generous, being courageous, right? Because they have a better safety support. They have more opportunities, right? Being rich and wealthy, being connected to rich and wealthy families gives you a better safety net and lets you take more chances, gives you more room to be virtuous. Whereas people who are not wealthy, people who are born into poverty, have fewer chances, have less opportunities, and in some cases are forced into more risky choices. Right? If my options are to starve or to steal a loaf of bread, then maybe I'm forced into stealing, and I have to make that choice because of poverty. Right? It's nothing. It's not my responsibility. It's nothing that I did, except that I am poor. So being poor here has moral consequences. Right? It changes the kinds of decisions that you make. It changes the kinds of behaviors you make. It changes the kind of character that you have. And some of this is a matter of just pure and simple luck. So I just wanted to raise this question because sometimes people like talking about this, especially in a professional engineering ethics context. I think it's an interesting question about how much does this stuff rest on luck. Was it just unlucky that the O-rings failed on the Challenger explosion? Was it just unlucky that people died in those Pinto fires? To what extent can engineering disasters be blamed on pure luck as opposed to the decisions that we make? With the Challenger explosion in particular, the commission afterwards that looked into the failure and what happened made it very clear that the result was not a forced error, but it was completely unforced, that we took unnecessary risks beyond what was necessary, and that if we had made responsible decisions, that explosion would not have happened. We can't control everything, but we're responsible for some things that we can't control. And at the Challenger explosion, people thought that, in fact, we did have enough control to stop this from happening, and we didn't take that control. We didn't use that control. But is that always the case? Can there be cases of engineering ethics where, in fact, people were just unlucky, and there's really nothing you can do about it? I'm going to leave that as an open question for you all to talk about in the discussion forum. Okay. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, just very briefly, is integrity as a virtue. Aristotle doesn't talk about integrity himself very much. He talks about other virtues, but integrity is in kind of, in a sense, it's the virtue. It's the virtue that binds all the other virtues together. Honesty is important. It's important to tell the truth, but honesty doesn't matter much if you only tell the truth sometimes, and some other times you lie, right? Honesty isn't just about telling the truth. Honesty is about telling the truth consistently, reliably. If you're honest, not only do you tell the truth now, but I can count on you to tell the truth in the future, right? So what makes honesty a virtue is not just the truth-telling, it's the consistency, and that's where integrity comes in. So let me talk just a little bit about integrity. In an ethics context, integrity is often about moral uprightness, having strong moral principles, rectitude, righteousness, trustworthiness, fairness, scrupulous honesty, but having rectitude in the sense of having these principles regardless of changing circumstances, being a stable moral figure, and that really relates to the other sense of integrity of being whole or undivided. In fact, there's a further definitions here: being unified, unimpaired, or in sound construction, right? Having consistency, not corruption, right? So being whole and undivided, integrity is unified, is coherent, is solid. So I want to say that integrity here is the virtue. It's the most important of the virtues in the sense that all the other virtues are virtuous because they also have integrity. Integrity is a matter of being consistent and reliable. And one of the things I want to say is that any organization functions in virtue of the consistency and reliability of its parts. So let me pull up this video. I've shown this in class before. So I'm playing this on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and take off the audio. I think you all can hear me still. Okay, yeah. So this is a video of Autodesk Incorporated from 2007 to 2011. This is a video of their business hierarchy. Every circle is an employee. The bigger circles are managers, and the smaller circles are their subordinates. And so the CEO is at the very center, and it sort of fans out so that the lowest ranking people are at the outside rim. And the closer you go to the center, the more power you have in the organization. And you can see this organization adjust itself over time. Different divisions move in and out of other places. Different units get shuffled around all over the place. Some of these units are more independent than others, right? This little corner over here seems to be hanging mostly free of the rest of the organization. You'll see over the course of this video that there's lots of different restructurings of the organization. They acquire other firms. They reorganize as a service business as opposed to a industry-focused one, or yeah, a product-based business as opposed to a. I'm sorry, they go to an industry-focused one from a product-based business, and that requires significant reorganization on the inside. So this is an organism. This is a social organism, alive, active, and you're seeing how it acts. And you can see that some of it changes, but some of these structures stay stable over time. And it's the stability over time that gives the system integrity. What integrity really is a matter of the functional parts of the system working together to support the other functional parts of a system, so that the whole thing maintains itself as a coherent unit over time. This is what's key in all organized systems, including biological organizations, but also social organizations like businesses. These organizations only stay together, can only maintain themselves if the parts all function properly in this arete sense of functioning well. So that the whole system maintains itself. Right? Organizations only work because the parts of the system have integrity and function together. If you come to the live lectures over the next few days, I will talk more about integrity, biological integrity especially, and I'll talk about how systems self-organize to become persistent organizations over time. But one thing I want to say here is about Gioia. So a lot of people claim about Gioia that they sympathize with his actions. They can see themselves making the same action. So maybe Gioia doesn't really have a bad character. Maybe he did the wrong thing, but maybe he's not really a bad person. So what I want to say is that the answer of whether Gioia is a bad person has to be answered by asking about his integrity, whether Gioia's decisions reflected his integrity. And it's very clear that even before the Pinto case happened, Gioia was not a man of very strong integrity. He makes it very clear that at the beginning he has these strong moral principles from college that when he gets into the business world he abandons almost immediately. Right? So in other words, you can't trust a person like Gioia to carry those principles into the business world and keep them reliably. Right? He's a man of without integrity precisely because he can't keep to those principles when it counts, when it matters. When the rubber hits the road, he abandons the principles as soon as he can. And that's a failure of character. That's a failure of his integrity. That's not just that he did the wrong thing, but that it shows that he's not a dependable person. He's not a reliable person. He's not the kind of person that we should trust being in positions of authority like this. So I think integrity is an absolutely crucial issue. I think really this week's lesson online is somewhat sparse in terms of the material that I've given you. I've given you the good engineer article and some discussions of Aristotle, the moral luck discussion. There's not a whole lot of material there. What I really want you to do is think very hard about your own integrity as a person and what values you want to maintain stable going forward, what values you want to inform your decision-making going forward. That's really the point of this class, is to give you an opportunity to figure out who you are as a coherent person, what values you have, and what values you're willing to defend. Maybe this doesn't come clear so clear through the lecture, but hopefully in this discussion I've helped explain why integrity is an important virtue. All right, I'm done. I've gone way over time. If you have any questions, please leave them in the discussion. I'm excited to hear what you all say. Thanks everyone for showing up to the discussion forum. Make sure to sign in on the sign-in sheet. I'll see you all next week. Bye.